Crime and Punishment, wrote by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, Part 1, Chapter 1, read by Connor 500. At the beginning of July, during a spell of exceptionally hot weather, towards evening, a certain young man came down onto the street from the little room he rented from some tenants in the lane, and slowly, almost hesitantly, set off towards the bridge. He had succeeded in avoiding an encounter with his landlady on the stairs. His room was situated right under the roof of a tall, 5-storey tenement building, and sooner resembled a closet than a place of habitation. His landlady, from whom he rented this room, with dinner and a maid, lived on the floor below in a separate apartment, and each time he wanted to go down to the street, he had to pass his landlady's kitchen, the door of which was nearly always wide open onto the stairs. And each time, as he passed it, the young man had a morbid sense of fear, of which he was ashamed and of which caused him to frown. He was heavily in debt to his landlady, and was afraid of running into her. Not that he was particularly timid or cowed, quite the opposite indeed, but for some time now he had been in a tense, irritable state of mind that verged upon hypochondria. So absorbed in himself had he grown, so isolated from everyone else, that he was actually afraid of meeting anyone at all, not simply his landlady. He had been crushed by poverty, but even his reduced circumstances had of late ceased to be a burden to him. His vital interests no longer concerned him. He did not even wish to think about them. As a matter of fact, no landlady on earth had the power to make him afraid, whatever she might be plotting against him. But to have to stop on the stairs and listen to all of that mediocre rubbish that had nothing whatsoever to do with him, all those pestering demands for payment, those threats and complaints, and be compelled in response to shift his ground, make excuses, tell lies. No, it was better to slink down those steps like a cat and steal away, unseen by anyone. As he emerged onto the street on this occasion, however, his terror of meeting his creditress shocked even him. I planned to attempt a thing like this, yet I allow that kind of rubbish to scare me, he thought with a strange smile. Yes, everything lies in a man's hands, and if he lets it all slip out past his nose, it's purely out of cowardice. That's an axiom. It's a curious reflection. What are people most afraid of? Of doing something new? Saying a new word of their own that hasn't been said before? That's what scares them the most. But I'm rambling. That's why I never do anything, because I ramble onto myself like that. Dostoyevsky, I do the same. Connor 500 does the same. Or perhaps it's the other way around. I ramble because I never do anything. It's during this past month that I've picked up this habit of rambling, lying on my back for whole days and nights, on end in my room and thinking about cloud cuckoo land. Well, why am I on my feet now? Am I really capable of this? Is this a serious matter? Of course it isn't. It's just a fantasy to amuse myself with. It's just pretty pictures. Yes, I do believe that's all it is. Just pretty pictures. Outside, the heat was terrible, with humidity to make it worse, and the crowds of people, the slacked lime everywhere, the scaffolding, the bricks, the dust, and that distinctive summer aroma, so familiar to every inhabitant of St. Petersburg who has not the means to rent a dacha in the country. All these things had a shattering effect on the young man's already jangled nerves. The unbearable stench from the drinking dens, of which there are in this quarter of this city inordinately many, and the drunks he kept running into every moment or two, even though it was still working hours, completed the sad and loathsome colouring of the scene. An emotion of the most profound repugnance flickered for a moment in the young man's features. It may be worth observing that he was remarkably handsome, with beautiful dark eyes and dark chestnut-coloured hair. He was taller than average, slim and well built, but soon he appeared to fall into a deep brooding, which might more be correctly described as a kind of oblivion. And now, as he walked along, he ceased to be aware of his surroundings, nor had he any desire to be aware of them. Only occasionally did he mutter something to himself, a consequence of that addiction to monologues that he himself had so recently acknowledged. At this moment he himself was conscious that every so often his thoughts grew confused, and that he was very weak. For 2 days now he had had practically nothing to eat. So poorly dressed was he that another man, even one inured to such a living, would have been ashamed to have gone out on the street during the daytime in such rags. However, this particular district was of such a kind that it would have been difficult to surprise anyone by one's manner of dress. The proximity of the Haymarket, the abundance of brothels, and the local population, which was, for the most part, made up of tradesmen and craftsmen, and huddled together in these streets and lanes of St. Petersburg centre, sometimes enlivened the general panorama with such picturesque subjects that it would have been odd for anyone to have been surprised at encountering the occasional freak. But by this time, so much vicious contempt had built up in the young man's soul, that in spite of all of his sometimes very youthful finickiness, he was at least ashamed of his rags while out on the street. It would have been another matter had he ran into people he knew, or any of his erstwhile student colleagues, whom in general he hated meeting at all times. And yet, when a drunken man, who at that moment was being hauled off down the street, heaven knows where or why, in an enormous wagon, drawn by an equally enormous cart horse, suddenly shouted to him as he rode past, "Hey, you, German hatter," and began to bellow at him in the top of his voice, pointing at him. The young man suddenly stopped and grabbed convulsively at his hat. The hat had been one of those tall, round affairs from Zimmermann's, but was now completely worn out and faded, covered in holes and stains, and missing its brim, so much so that it cocked over to one side at a most outlandish angle. It was not shame that had assailed him, however, but an emotion of quite a different kind, one much more akin to terror. "I might have known it," he muttered in confusion. "I thought as much. This is worse than any of it. It is exactly this sort of nonsense, some vulgar, little trivial detail, that could ruin the whole plan. Yes, a hat that's too conspicuous. It's absurd, which is why it's conspicuous. What I need now to go with my rags is a peaked cap. Any old flat top would do, but not this museum piece. Nobody wears things like this. It would be spotted a mile off. People would remember it. And the main thing is that it would be remembered afterwards. The main thing," I've almost said that twice there, "and bang, they'd have their evidence. In this sort of business you have to be as inconspicuous as possible. The details, it's the details that matter more than anything else. It's that sort of detail that ruins everything.